When you are the startup or technology developers or whatever, the first thing to do is to figure out who is your customer, because people still don't understand what that means to have a customer, and that the customer is the person who pays, and that the
Yeah.
customer is the person with the problem. And by the way, sometimes the more complicated stuff becomes when the customer and end users are two different people. I try to be versatile, but as I said, people like the letters after my last name. So a lot of things that I've done are biomedical. And in biomedical field, the end user and the customer are always different people. If you're developing the surgical equipment, the surgeon is not your customer. They're your end user. So you need to figure out who is your customer and figure out what problem you're selling for that person. And the problem, by the way, with the customer is that in the majority of the cases, the customers actually, they can't formulate their own problem. And you can't come to people and say, what's your problem?
Right. You can say that. What's the problem? And
Yeah.
you start the fight.
Before you start figuring out what the pattern and how you commercialize it, you need to figure that out, because out of this knowledge, a lot of things will fall into place. Because if you know your customer, if you know the problem, those customers, first of all, probably already trying to solve this problem, which comes to another of my favorite things. Never, ever, 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 ever say that there's no competition, because the only thing that there is no competition if nobody cares. Because if the problem is real, if the customer is real, they are trying to solve this problem somehow. And most likely your business model will be to follow what they're trying to do right now, because it's very hard to have too many unknowns, right? You don't know the customer, you don't know how to get to them. So you better get at least initially to them the way how they get their current solution, even if it's bad. And after you've done that, you're already on the market.
Welcome to the Haggai podcast. Buckle up. This episode is brought to you by Cards Biz, a business card too good to give away. This episode is brought to you by Better Weight for Life, transformational weight loss aid, led by U.S. board-certified physicians, providing access to GLP-1 medications like Wegovy and Zepbound that are proven to help you lose weight and keep it off.
Hello, Eugene.
All right. Hello, Haggai.
All right. So, full disclosure, we have known each other for, I'm scared to think now.
Yeah, I think 15, 16, 17, something like that.
Like the number
So
keeps going up, right? The number keeps going
I
up.
I actually got some reminders recently, but I'm bad with numbers.
Not that bad, but it's a bit scary over this time. And for other years we become friends. So it's like and we've even worked together. So this should
So we
like be
tried, and it was not successful, but
and throughout that, like for all the time I've known you, you've been at the front line of open innovation, technology transfer. So I'll be very happy. Like people who don't know Eugene, like who's Eugene?
well, I have those prepared phrases, like, but that's definitely true. So I still have trouble explaining what I do to my parents and kids. Although the kids now at least have some impression of what I do, but they still have trouble to explain it. So I have very unusual both the background and everything with it. Definitely coming from the academic background. So I have medical degree, PhD in genetic. That's all from the old country that doesn't exist anymore, from Soviet Union. And then I came to US in '94, spent some time at the Harvard Medical School doing the postdoctoral studies. A lot of stories there, so there are still papers that have been referenced. So I'm getting notice when some
Are
of
you
the
still
papers that
being like fifth author to this day?
I don't know. I'm getting notices from those places that your paper has been referenced. I said, okay, I mean it's almost a shame, but I hope the science move ahead. But at some point, I kind of got a little bit tired of science in the sense of I was tired of coming to work and doing the same thing. So intellectually, I was curious enough, but I haven't seen enough results. And also, again, one of the other jokes that I use is I realized the line to Nobel Prize is way too long. So I literally bought the book that came out in '99 that's called Alternative Careers in Science. I still have it on my shelves, and was flipping through the pages. What else can I do with those backgrounds of mine? And I came to those words: technology transfer, business development. And I immediately recognized that business development very often means sales, and that's not me. But the business development that's actually business development, that sounds like fun. And I did one thing that I probably shouldn't be announcing loudly and publicly, but I returned the year of NIH funding back to the government and went to consulting.
Wow.
So that's what I've been doing since
Like
'99.
you're like one in a million who did it, or the only one who ever did that?
No, actually at that time it was already different a little bit. So I was actually congratulated by my scientific peers saying, "Oh, you got a real job. Congratulations." But it was literally like the first year probably, because I would say the year before I would be ostracized for selling my soul for money. Back in time, it was probably twice the money I was getting as a scientist, but nothing close to what people would think big money are.
Yeah. So before we continue, like I know not everybody knows what technology transfer is. So what is
Right.
technology transfer?
That's an interesting animal, and I never got to the technology transfer itself. Actually, when I started looking into that, I went down to the MGH technology transfer office and tried to kind of get into
MGH? What's MGH?
Massachusetts General Hospital. So it's Harvard affiliate, so that's where I worked, kind of on the upper floor. So the tech transfer office was on the first floor. So I walked in, and the director back then spent an hour explaining why I shouldn't be doing that, because at that time they had some litigation and they were trying to define the word related. But that's a sad story. So the basic technology transfer is moving technology out of academia into the real world. And we now have 50 years of law here in US that's called Bayh-Dole that actually mandates that all research institutions should look into commercializing some of the research. So that means that there are technology transfer offices in majority of the universities. They all overworked and understaffed, and that's provided at least some of the work for consultants like me to help them. In some occasions, I was hired to deal with the hard-to-deal faculty because a lot of politics happened in academia. And I would sometimes say, this is terrible technology, but this is a full professor. We cannot tell him that. So you tell them. But another thing was that because there's no specific career path. That's another interesting point about tech transfer. So the people who are getting into tech transfer are either from technical backgrounds or business. And the business people usually have trouble understanding the science, and the scientists are usually catching up to business reasonably quickly. So that kind of, I think, where I came from. But still, a lot of actual work was literally being like the psychiatrist or translator to connecting the academic world to the world of industry, business. I would say, I usually call it the real world.
So what does that mean? Like, what does that mean in practical sense, right? So like, I think that's a nice description. But let's say I'm a university, I have a physics department or medical school, and somebody developed something. Okay,
Right.
like what?
It depends a lot on the area, and it used to be that most of the academic tech transfer was about biotech. So the drugs, the biotech. For better or for worse, I think everybody's now trying to include all the other fields. So you start from physics professor, right? So those were probably not very much touched by the technology transfer. But the general idea is that somebody needs to look over the shoulder of the scientist, and I can tell you that it's not done regularly, and it's rarely done even in the big institutions. But looking over the shoulder what they do and say, this project might have potentially some practical application. And of course, that would immediately solicit the angry response from the scientist. Oh, I'm not interested in the applied science. I'm the basic scientist. So that's why the applied science been now replaced for something like translational research. And if there is any potential that it will become useful, then the tech transfer people become bad guys and they say, now you can't publish until we actually put the patent together and make sure that this is protected.
Okay.
So there are a lot of caveats in this profession, and that's why majority of the tech transfer is still considered by scientists as bad people. And
Because they hinder their career progression.
Yeah, they prevent them from publication. And like it or not, again, it's been discussed for many, many years that one of the big issues is that this innovation activities or patents is not on the tenure track evaluation list. So the scientists actually don't have enough incentive except seeing their colleagues to drive in on the Porsche one day. But that's a long, long path. But it's a popular expression. So when they see that one of their colleagues drive in, they would immediately get into line to the tech transfer office. They don't. So that's kind of how it happened. And I was most of this time considered the bad guy within the tech transfer people because I was a consultant that was helping them and in a sense showing that there might be inefficiency and might be something that they're missing. Because one of the things that I was doing is the usually kind of in the industry, by the way, Israeli tech transfer is one of the oldest in the world. So YISUM is tech transfer organization at Hebrew University. I think it's officially the second in the world. Historically, so the first one is, I think, just historically, I think the first one is the Imperial College in London, and YISUM was second. So they actually, and on a global scale, probably figured out more than others. But also, there are different models of how those offices operate. Some of them report to like the provost of research, and that's probably not the best idea. In other places, they operate as businesses, but they're not really bringing much of the revenue back to university because it's just the path is too long, right? So we all know about a couple of those big blockbuster drugs, and of course the Googles that also came from the university. But this is one of the, I don't know, million, and it takes long time.
So, can you give us a more typical example of something that you've experienced? Like, again, just to give a concrete
Right.
example of like what it takes and what are the steps that technology
Yeah.
goes through until it's commercialized.
Sure. First of all, I want us eventually to get off the tech transfer because there is another
Yeah.
side of the equation, right?
Yeah.
But usually, let's say if we're talking about some sort of the biomedical science, we usually have an early stage invention or something that could be an invention, right? So it's a research project. Some professor comes or postdoc comes with the idea that this mechanism, the drug, this whatever pathway might be working this way, and if you block this part of the pathway, it will shut down something downstream. And that's like in a million years might end up with a drug that can do it and then cure something. So if that's how it looks, again, the first way is to patent it, and then they start looking into what are the options to actually bring it to the market. And obviously, there are major two ways of doing it. One is you can develop it unto the point and then license it out to people who know what to do with this knowledge. And that's usually going to be either big pharma or let's say mid-sized pharma or sometimes even the larger biotechs like we used to have the Biogens of the world. The other path is to actually create the company around it and make it into a startup, which again, for the biomedical projects, that would usually take a lot of time, a lot of money, because at the end of the day, the biggest money would go into the clinical trial. And all the stories about the drugs have been very expensive. Of course, it's very upsetting, but people need to realize that it takes like years and years of development, and it's like 1 in a million that actually makes it. And then when they're ready after all those trials and everything, there's probably like 3 to 5 years left of the patent life. So the company is just trying to recover what they spent in developing that. It's changed a lot because, as I said, the biotech, and if I think in my experience, the biotech is really not existing much anymore because big pharma bought everything that moved some years ago. There's kind of new rising companies are trying to do things, but because it's so long and so expensive, we don't see that much. But the digital health and everything about medical devices, this is something that moves much faster. And with medical device, I mean, you're probably better off sometimes to create the company that might still be acquired or probably should be acquired by the big guys. But at least you can get into the prototype stage. You can do some testing on the animals or cadavers before becoming something valuable.
Okay.
But the key is, again, back to what I was doing as a consultant, right, is to figure out early enough and with certain type of certainty if that's worth doing. Because as I said, the success rate is incredibly small. So we know that out of startups, right, we have 90% of them dying. With the early stage technology, I don't think that we will even make it onto the scale of the percentage. So it's very low. Those early assessments, that's figuring out that it actually makes sense to move forward. That's the main things that I've been doing for the transfer offices. Very early assessment. And I've been doing it a little bit different than a lot of people. I'm kind of by nature, I'm a very skeptical person. So in one of the companies I worked to, we did the aptitude test. So I got 99% of skepticism. So my approach is I'm trying to kill the
And then
project.
you were skeptic about the test.
Well, I was okay with the test. Of course, when we did it, all our wives told us that we wasted the company money because they could have just told us who we are. But still, again, I use it as an excuse to be very negative. So, and that's how I look at the project when I look at it. So I try to figure out what's problem with it and try to prove that it's not worth doing. If I cannot do it in a very short time, that proves that it's worth to do to the next step. That's about it. But again, the most important part is, I think, and that's where kind of I want to switch this conversation, is the other side of the equation, right? Because of course I grew up in academia, so I still have a sweet spot to it, and I know, and people there take me as their own, so which gives me some
And
advantage.
your papers are still being mentioned, even
Yeah,
though you
papers
did.
still being referenced, and I have those letters after my last name, so a lot of the biomedical people think that they can have the intelligent conversation with me. But the more interesting and more, I would say, productive part is actually working for the other side, meaning for the industry, for the companies that are looking for something. And that's where this whole idea of the open innovation came. from. And it kind of appeared exactly when I moved into the consulting. So I think that literally the Henry Chesborough published this book on open innovation. There was a lot of buzzing around, and it's been used in very wrong context for many times. But I think it's basically just, kind of reality that we lived in. And the basic explanation what happened, I would say probably 20, 25 years ago, was that the knowledge become equally distributed. Nobody could anymore kind of claim the monopoly on excellence, monopoly on knowledge, and monopoly on the brightest people who work for them, which means that some of the great things could happen anywhere in the world. And also companies realize that they cannot really afford the whole cycle from idea to the product. Even the Googles of the world today probably can't afford it for multiple reasons. One is it just takes too much time. Right? So we're no longer thinking about developing in 10, 15 years or something, right? Because if we need it yesterday. I usually, when I talk to students, I say, hey, look, the speed of technology is very easy to check by how often you change your cell phone. So at least 2-3 years, right? And they become totally different. So imagine if you start developing something from the idea and the concept, it'll probably take you 3-4 years just to come up with a prototype. So it's not worth it. And the second, of course, is money. So that's why all those companies start looking for technologies that are sort of semi-cooked or maybe not cooked at all. So sometimes they do look for the early stage, like in academia, so that they can get a hold of it and direct them and use them and just finish the development and use what they know to get.
So just for our listeners' sake, and just to make sure to put a thing, let's say in the world of, so there's one side of this world which is A, where people buy companies outright, and they buy them for the combination of revenue, people, staff, technology, and market share. Here we're talking about almost raw technology.
Yeah, and there are much more, again, there are all those graphs that this whole open innovation actually make business viable again. Because before that, it used to be only, you develop something, you sell it, right? That's it. And development become long and expensive. So now with the open innovation, first of all, you shorten development because you can find something that is almost done or at least partially done, and you can combine with something else. And then there are other sources of income now. So in addition to just selling things, you now can spin something out as a company. You can license it out. And I work with a lot of large companies. So one of the big deals that I've done in the past was for kind of consumer product company, and they had some biosensor technology, right? They realized that they're not going to do it, right? So like putting the gold-plated sensors in a diaper is probably not a good idea. But the technology was great. The R&D was very solid. So they actually licensed it out to a company that was developing something totally different, like the diagnostic device. And we're just getting this license and revenue. So that's
in this example, it's not only big companies looking for individual inventors and small companies in academia. It's also big companies themselves spinning off technologies that are not in their core business.
Yeah. And, I'm sure, I don't know, it's probably not that popular anymore, but we all remember this funnel, right? That we see the picture when a lot of ideas, I think thousands or millions of ideas coming from the wide end, and then like one or two products coming off the other end. So the best analogy that I've heard from one of my friends and colleagues was that this funnel is actually no longer solid. There are a lot of holes in that funnel, which means that some ideas the ideas and technologies coming in and getting out of that funnel at different stages. And they all could potentially be valuable. Like if it's getting out, again, something like for the aerospace company develop some technology that might be used in food, right? Definitely not their business. They don't care about that, but they license it out and they're getting the revenue from that.
So give us how does this market work? Well, I mean, both on the demand side and on the sell side. What are the mechanics? Who are the players in this?
Right. I think first of all, again, it cannot work unfortunately on their own. And I don't know. I think we now in the whatever 10th or whatever rounds of new wave of intermediaries that say, hey, we just put everything online. Or today they say, oh, we just employ the AI agents and they will match these things. Kind of in my experience, again, I've seen a lot of those. So back to my skepticism, I don't think this new wave is also going to be successful. It does require a lot of human interaction.
Why? What's specific about this? What about this makes it so difficult that there can't be a marketplace for it? Or unless a marketplace is not enough?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that the first one, I say again, what I experienced personally is that the business is done between people, not companies. And again, I think that's specifically true with Israel. And I've done a lot of business with Japan. And to my big surprise, Japanese and Israeli businesses are doing very well together, which was total surprise to me. Kind of if you consider the general culture of the, I don't know, the super organized and scheduled and formal with the Israelis that I know, like for somebody was telling that the people coming to the interview in the flip-flops, right?
Yeah.
But when you put them together, I think the key component would make it work very well between two of those business culture was the fact that in both of those, the business is very personal. You're literally not doing business with people you don't like.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you need to have those interactions. That's one. The second one, I think, is that now probably with the AI and with everything else, with the power, it's much easier to find things, right? So,
Yeah.
which is again, I think the Google or whatever should change and stop calling what they do as a search engine because nobody's interested in searching, right? People are interested in finding. So we need to have a find engine, not a search engine. But now we can find things. But how we make sure that it actually there is a fit. So it needs to be this judgment call. And as much as I think we can teach AI a little bit, but I don't see right now, it's almost probably like the story with this computer playing chess, right? It needs to learn how to be non-linear, non-standard, make mistakes, because I think the most interesting examples are kind of across industry. If you read a lot of books on this open innovation, I think one of the classical examples one was the company that actually used to be here in Boston. They were looking for technology to prevent defects in the semiconductor manufacturing because sometimes there are bubbles and then you just throwing out the whole wafer production. And they found a solution in the industry of the champagne because that's where they try to make more bubbles. So if you know how to make more bubbles, you can figure out how to make fewer bubbles. So obviously, semiconductor manufacturers in Silicon Valley would never look into the wine manufacturer for that. Again, in my experience, as I mentioned, so we were looking for literally the company who was making the cookware, and they were looking for the specific coating technology. And I asked him, "Have you talked to somebody at Aerospace?" I said, "No. Why would we? We're in food business." But obviously, in the aerospace, they have lots of different
A lot of
experience
coding
with
issues.
coding under the very, very harsh condition, right? Because that's where they're sending it. So I think this, at least in my experience, for now, I don't think it could be formalized. It requires this just crazy brainstorming.
So okay, so let's go back to the dynamic. How does this market work?
So
even
again,
even in its inefficient way, in its human inefficient way.
right. Thinking, and that's kind of my approach for now, is I'm totally sold into the idea that, first of all, you're not commercializing inventions, you're solving problems. So everything you do needs to start with the problems. So sometimes, and in this model, like there are buyers and sellers, the problem probably belongs to the big guys. Unfortunately, very few of them can actually formulate what the problem is. And again, that's where one place where I used to be helping and still helping sometimes, literally sitting with all the main people involved in the project and try to figure out what they're actually looking for. And again, my classic example is it's at some point I already had signed contract with one food company that were looking for technology. And when I had everybody in the room for the kickoff meeting, I realized that the problem they have is a real estate problem.
How come?
Because the actually technology existed, but the machines that they were doing that, they couldn't put it on the factory floor because they didn't have literally physical space. So their choice was stop the production, do some construction to expand the space, or find something that will fit into this tiny little corner. And I tell them, look, seriously, I'm not the one solving your real estate problem, but there was no technical problem. And so sometimes you need, for let's say one of my favorite technologies that I'm still using, the probiotics, when we were trying to help them to commercialize, we had very big interest in some of the yogurt manufacturers. Seems logical, right? But then we got the marketing person in the room, and the guy say absolutely no. And I said, why? He said, because he said, look, we want to put on our yogurt the words life culture, and your probiotic is in spores, and spores are not formally alive. So we cannot put it in life culture, so we're not interested, even though it can do everything, solve all the problems. So that's one of the, again, another place where probably hard to deal with. So that's one thing. So when you're finding those potential leads, is to make sure that there is at least some correlation, there is some reason to move to the next step, and then you need to really hold their hands through the process, because there all this fear is that when you have negotiations, there are all these pinches, right? little things that go wrong, and you can allow only so many of them. And again, one of my classic examples, and I apologize if people who hear that already have heard that from me, is that literally these scientists and business people talk different language. Unfortunately, they use the same words. So I literally have this a situation when I had the scientist and the business guy talking, and they agree that there needs to be additional experiment in the lab, and they agree that needs to be done soon. And they were ready to leave until I stopped them and said, well, let's figure out what that soon means. And of course, for the
And he meant
academic
in the
part,
next week, and the other guy meant the next year.
yeah, well, not that dramatic, but for the academics, it was definitely a month or 2 or 3, and the business guy almost had a heart attack, right? Because for him, the soon is like week is the maximum.
Yeah, weeks. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so that negotiation, that holding hands to make sure that this relationship is staying. And then the final piece is actually to figure out what the structure of the deal is. Because it became, as I said, with open innovation, there are many more options than it used to be. So as I said, it's not just merger and acquisition, right? Sometimes there is nothing to acquire. It might be just technology out of the garage or out of the university. So some of the large companies today have what they call external venture group that are looking for those technologies that are relevant, and they literally just invest in them and keep them on the arm's length to make sure that things are going well, and then they decide if it's worth to acquire. Some others do just pure licensing, say, thank you very much, just give us the right to finish this development, and we'll give you the royalty whatever things happen, which make, again, very complicated calculation, because the earlier you get it, the more complicated it is to figure out what this particular invention will actually worth
Yeah.
at the end of product. And probably the third major piece is just the strategic partnership. When they say, listen, you're the small company, you do what you do, we will just look over your shoulder and we'll pay you a little bit to do some directional work towards our interest, and we'll see where it leads us.
Can you give us an example for each case that you describe, so people can have understand?
With the investments, it's very easy. So I've done a lot of
Okay.
work for a big holding company in Japan called Hoya, and actually brought them to Israel many times. And the group that I worked with was purely investment branch, so that was external venture. And in fact, they actually been credited internally for selling one of their companies to their direct competitor. So that was a little bit unusual, but they say, hey, we made a lot of money. That's worth it. So they had very specific areas of interest, and they invested in the companies as an investor. They're senior people on the boards, and that's one model. So the licensing is probably the most popular. So majority of I would say, the drug developments, the big pharma, this is what they're looking for in the academia, or at least used to, right? So there's another model right now that I missed. So if you look at some of the drug candidates, they usually licensed by the big company. So say they license this compound, and then they figure out if it works or not. And strategic partnerships is probably, again, the majority of all the other examples. We don't know them that much, and I don't think that I can throw names around, because that's usually reasonably confidential. But it definitely helps the company to, and I always say it actually much smarter money than the pure VC, because strategic partnership comes not just with the money, right? It comes with the access to markets, access to the expertise, sometimes experts to a lot of other things. Maybe one example I can bring is actually the Bayer, right? The big pharma company. They created what they called, I think, the incubator or something like that. I'm not sure if it's still operating in many places, where they invited companies, not even necessarily directly related to the Bayer business, but they were giving them the space on campus and giving them access to Bayer expertise, Bayer lawyers, Bayer equipment, Bayer interest, and sometimes something interesting would come out of it. But another model that I forgot is that now become more and more popular, which I think is definitely worth mentioning, is the sponsored research.
Sponsored research, which is very early on, right?
It's very early on, but now it's become even more important, right? So
why?
First, everybody's scared that they're not getting funding, and some of them don't. So now it's been sold to universities under the title alternative sources of funding. But for the industry, it's also much more interesting, because they're getting very early on, kind of literally on the ground floor of the research. And many of them don't have much of the research on their own anymore, right? Because, as I said, it's expensive, long, whatever. And they could direct that research. with very little involvement in a sense of for them, monetary or otherwise. They could sponsor, for example, a student, right? Or they can again be core developers of some of the projects. They even publish together, and then there is not much of the obligation, right? They'll see where it's going. So if it's
Yeah.
going somewhere, they have much better rights and easy position to negotiate, because I can tell you, industry hates negotiating with university over licenses.
So when they do sponsored research, who owns the IP?
It depends. So it become much more creative.
Okay.
Sometimes they could do it together. Some they split it, or sometimes say, hey, if we're paying for that, we own it. So it's much more creative than the original work.
So let me ask you a question. In this world, do you have to have a patent, or
No.
can you? Okay. Can you do
Well,
deals without a
and
patent?
that's another thing. Again, I'm sorry. I know you talk to a lot of the venture capitalists. I'm not very big on venture capitalists, because they think they know better. And when we start talking about the startups, right, it's very hard actually to evaluate the startup world. It's to value the startup, right?
Yeah.
So it's a different story that happens with all this.
So how are deals done if you don't have a patent?
Well, again, I think back to where I started, and I lost it for a second. This train of thought is that VCs, I think, push people to this word patent, patent, patent.
Yeah.
And for now, very often this is, well, first of all, this is not the only way to protect your intellectual property, right? But another point is, in some cases, it's actually the wrong way to protect your intellectual property. Let me give you one example that was real.
Yeah, please.
Company that I consulted with, the small startup. They were developing some kind of biomedical gadget that wouldn't require much of the approval. They had technology. They were talking to people, and everybody, they were looking for investors, and investors were telling them, you need to patent, you need to patent. So they did the research and say, yes, we can patent, but as every small company, they have limited resources.
Yeah.
So the question that they came to me with was, hey, do we need to patent, or are we spending those money actually on product development and sales? And I sat with them and said, look, let's do the simple calculation. So you're developing this gadget, assuming everything goes well, when is going to be on the market? They said, well, again, depending how we use the money, but let's say 2-3 years. I said, okay, now how long it will stay on the market? I said, well, all those gadgets coming and going, right? So we expect maybe 5 years if we're lucky, but probably less. I said, okay, so let's now get back to the patent. So you are now applying for the patent. And by the way, US patent office is backlogged for, I think, at least for year and a half.
Yeah.
So you'll hear from them year and a half. If everything goes smoothly, in 2 or 3 years, you actually get patent granted. And now you have 20 years, but your product is long gone from the market. So why bother? So this is one kind of angle to think about.
But this isn't the case. They don't have to, quote unquote, protect the.
Right. So which very often being first on the market is much more valuable than to be protected, because this protection only works if somebody really, really wants to steal something from you. And usually, again, these days, I think company more interested to do something different. And another point is that the patent, the people need to remember, patent is a full disclosure. So you must write the patent almost as a manual. So whoever wants to must be able to take the patent and literally repeat what you've done. Yeah. So if it's something that is not that hard to reverse engineer, and you can prove that they made it reading your patent, then you actually in a very weak position, and you just gave away your knowledge.
Yeah, your secret sauce.
Right. So in many cases, and I think that people and companies needs to seriously consider that, how to protect. I mean, it must be protected, right? Because again, my joke is, you try to sell something. To sell it, you need to own it. I can't sell your stuff, even if I want to.
You can, but...
Well, again, we can figure it out, but formally, no. Yeah. So the way of owning is what intellectual property is. And in many cases, yes, the trade secret or know-how is much more valuable. And even if you have the patent, right, most likely the know-how would need to come with it. Yeah. Because, you are the one who actually figured out how to do it. Maybe you need to spit into this vial 3 times. And that's, again, where the lawyers come to play, because they write those patents that this full disclosure still doesn't make you really understand what's going on. But that's a different story. I don't want to offend anybody. and of course, the copyright is also become. So now if we are in the world of the AI and the software, right? So all those things are copyrighted. You can barely patent anything there.
Yeah. So okay. So a lot of my audience is for this podcast are startups. Okay. So I'm a startup, okay? And let's say I have developed the technology. And I know I'm going to make this a difficult question in some ways because it's very
All right.
vague and wide. So I developed a technology, and now I have a choice behind me. I can pursue any one of those models, right? I can go raise money. I can try to do strategic partnerships. I can try to license it and all of that. What are the considerations that should be going through the individual inventor's mind or the early, very, very, very early startup? It's kind of a make that decision based on this your
You
experience.
make it not hard. You make it very dangerous because you got me into the area that I cannot stop talking about.
Well, we do have to cut at some point.
So when you are the startup or technology developers or whatever, the first thing to do is to figure out who is your customer. And
Well,
without that,
but
it's
that's true. But I would say that's true for almost any startup, right? That's
yeah,
true for a startup that
not
sells
almost.
iPhone
It's
covers.
any startup, but I could tell you that almost nobody does it. Right. So
Okay.
I'm still saying because people still don't understand what that means to have a customer, and that the customer is the person who pays, and that the
Yeah.
customer is the person with the problem. And by the way, sometimes the more complicated stuff becomes when the customer and end users are two different people. And if we go to, again, I try to be versatile, but as I said, people like the letters after my last name. So a lot of things that I've done are biomedical. And in biomedical field, the end user and the customer are almost always different people.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
that means that if you're developing the surgical equipment, the surgeon is not your customer.
Yeah.
They're your end user. So you need to figure out who is your customer and figure out what problem you're selling for that person, which is usually kind of again, I'm making the
No,
bad statement. I
even
know.
in your yogurt example, right? It's
Right.
like the yogurt would be better with the probiotics to the end consumer, but because the marketing statement would have changed, the actual customer who buys it doesn't want it, right?
That's right. But at least in this case, you know, the customer and the end user are the same people, right? So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
are the consumers. We buy it, we eat it.
Yeah.
It's just that we get and the problem, by the way, with the customer is that in majority of the cases, the customers actually, back to what I already said, they can't formulate their own problem, right? And you can't come to people and say, "What's your problem?" Right? So you need to figure it out and then kind of check it with
Unless you
it.
want to start a fight, right? You can say that. What's the problem? And
Yeah,
you start a fight, right?
right. Yeah, but it will be totally different.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's, again, before you start figuring out what the pattern and how you commercialize it, you need to figure that out, because out of this knowledge, a lot of things will fall into place, right? So
Okay.
I'm a big fan of the business model canvas. So because if you know your customer, if you know the problem, those customers are, first of all, probably already trying to solve this problem, which comes to another of my favorite things. Never, ever, 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 ever say that there's no competition, because the only thing that there is no competition if nobody cares. Because if the problem is real, if the customer is real, they are trying to solve this problem somehow. And most likely your business model will be to follow what they're trying to do right now, because it's very hard to have too many unknowns, right? You don't know the customer, you don't know how to get to them. So you better get at least initially to them the way how they get their current solution, even if it's bad. And after you've done that, you're already on the market. Now that your situation has changed completely. And I would usually say when you already start selling, you kind of stop being a startup, right? Because the goal of the startup, and I think I'm probably will be quoting more like the Steve Blank presentations, but the difference between the startup and established company is that for the startup and for the established company, the goal is actually to build a value.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered your questions, or
No,
I
no, no.
wiggled
It
out
did
a
answer
bit.
my question because I tell you why. Because everything you described is amazing and it's correct. But I would say this is true if you're selling cereal, right? And it's true if you're selling cereal, and I guess it's also true if you develop raw technology. But what's
Yeah.
unique into people who develop, like, again, I'm calling it raw technology. If there's a better terminology to use, please correct me. But it's like this, like they develop some sort of a know-how IP technology science.
Right. So now there's this word that I'm not particularly fan of, this deep tech, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not
Sure.
sure where it came from, but I think that's the point. I don't think there's a difference. It's just getting more complicated, because to understand who your customer is unlikely to be that last person on the value chain, the consumer. If you are making yogurt, yeah, that's what you do, right? You're
Yeah.
making the personal computer or whatever, the gadgets, your customer, your end user, you sell into the consumer. But if you're developing this, let's call it technology, then probably your customer is the next step in the value chain. So your customer might be, I don't know, aircraft manufacturer. I can.
Fine. So I've developed a new, I don't know, and maybe you can give an example. Okay, I figured out who the customer is. Okay, still, this is a deep tech, like let's use this term. It means I need to invest 3 years, 5 years, 20 years, I don't know, of development still till it's user ready. Let's say I can kind of make that argument that it's worth it. But again, how do I know? Should I go venture capital route or raise capital, or should I be rushing to license it? Again, from the individual entrepreneur's point of view, not from
Right. My personal opinion, and that's what I always tell people who want to listen or who wants to pay me to listen, is that I think the strategic partnership is much better. And there is no
Why?
such thing as talking to the strategic partners too early, right? Because
Okay.
sometimes you hear, oh, we're too early, we don't want to talk to them. Say, why? Well, because they steal it. Well, that's one thing, right? That never, ever, almost probably never happened, because the big guys usually have much more to lose. They lose their reputation, as I said, the business still.
I can't say it never happens. It
Yeah, again,
occasionally
I said I corrected myself almost, but I think the chances are much lower.
Yeah.
And I had more situation when actually the big guys don't want to see something because it might potentially interfere with their internal work. So they're, on general, they're much more careful. But as I said, having a strategic partner is much better, especially early on, because it gives you directionality. Because let's be honest, if we look at the venture capital, so the first question is, say, who is the customer for venture capital, right? That's definitely not the startups. It's their investors. So whatever they do,
even though I think the ones who play on the long run will tell you, but the reputation within the ecosystem does matter to some extent.
right? No, it does matter, but that's not where their customer is. So
Yeah.
again, they need to be sold on this vision. But if you're talking to the strategic partners, you can actually work with them. That's a conversation to have. And again, that's where those kind of relationship happens. So I think there is almost no kind of negative connotation with looking for strategic partners. And I can tell you again from my example, I have this one-time story when, so I usually try to reach out to those people, and I keep telling that there is not much of the magic in what I do. I'm just doing it probably longer than a lot of people, and that means that I know a lot of people. We're all moving around. This is all the same people in different companies. So I usually have better luck getting people answer to me. So you send out some information about technology to some corporate and say, hey, can you look at it? Is that something interesting, or who should we talk to in your company? And I usually get decent, like, I don't know, 30% responses. And in one case we had this response from the large company, from my clients, startup client, that sounded like this. Well, we're not interested, but if they can show this, this, and that, we could be interested to have a conversation. And the startup guys literally with this printout email went and raised money. Because now they have, which was absolutely zero commitment, right? But they showed that they're big companies understanding what's going on and say, hey, they say if we do it, they'll talk, let's fund us so that we can do it.
So, okay. So I'm a startup. I'm a deep tech startup. I've developed a new material, so on. I want to do a strategic partnership. Like, how do I go about it?
There are multiple things, and that's something I start playing with, the new concept that surprisingly nobody came up with the terminology. So I'm repossessing it. So it's called
You're
open
writing the book.
entrepreneurship.
You're writing the book.
Well, at some point maybe. So open entrepreneurship, and within this concept, first of all, there are kind of three pillars. Right. So one is a customer discovery. Again, let's not touch it, otherwise I'll get too long. The second one is a strategic partnership, and the one is the ecosystem. So the strategic partnership could be come in multiple flavors. The simplest one is you are talking to the company that's kind of trying to do something in the space that you already identify. And in that situation, I would usually suggest to reach out not to tier 1 company, but to tier 2, 3, right? Because they want to become tier 1, so they are much more, and also dealing with, right, and also they might be faster moving, right? Because they're probably smaller, more lean, so it's hard to deal with the very large companies because of even the bureaucracy. Now, the important part, again, is not to talk to R&D people, right? Because R&D people at best would consider you as a nuisance, but might consider you as a competitor or somebody who is showing that those guys are not doing their job, because, right, they're in R&D, they're supposed to do it. So you need to find the right people within this company to talk to, which is usually licensing, strategic. There used to be people with the open innovation and title. I don't think there are those titles anymore, but that's more or less kind of straightforward. So you find 2 or 3, whatever, as many of the company, and you reach out to them. And by the way, there is rarely anything kind of exclusive. I had one example when I reach out to multiple companies, and one of them say, "Hey, we'll pay your client $10,000 so that you don't show it to anybody for 3 months, because that's how long it take us to look at this." I said, "Sure." And after those 3 months, I said, "No, we're not interested, but you got the money."
Yeah.
But still, that's a straightforward. Now, the other ones are potentially much more interesting. Is that something that you missing on capabilities?
Okay.
And again, that's going back to this entrepreneurship is now similar to the open innovation, that you don't need to be an expert in everything. And it's rarely when you can be, I mean, maybe in some of the, I don't know, IT world, you can be the one who does everything, but usually it's very hard to build a company from, I don't know, 10 MBAs or 10 engineers, right? So you need to have multiple capabilities, multiple expertise. So your strategic partners could be looked at from the same standpoint. Hey, I have a great idea. I figured everything out about the market, the customer. I'm just not an engineer. So let's partner with the engineering company who would actually be interested to do it. And that could be, again, multiple markets. And it's for you as a startup to determine which one you're investing as a company and which ones you would consider as a side project and the additional sources of income. But the worst case scenario, you just get no or nobody replies.
Yeah.
Which
is what about again, you've been doing for a while. So what other tricks of a trade people need to be aware of? Tricks of a pitfalls, things to avoid, things they must do.
Well, I think, again, the list is too long. I think even though this idea of that you need to start with the problem, right, with the need is out, I think it's important to remember that as a startup, you need to focus on one, maybe one and a half. I would rarely consider two. And the company tend to have the laundry list of the problem they're solving. And that never sounds good. Okay? And also it's not realistic, because we all know that you have very limited resources. So you need to at least prioritize, but better figure out which one you're pursuing as your, how they call the beachhead market. And because when you are in the market, now you can expand in all those different problems. But to get to the market first, you need to really, 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 really focus. And on that focus, sometimes they forget how to put the criteria. And I will say, the first criteria is you need to actually care about this customer. That works in majority of the cases. And again, especially if we have biomedical or healthcare as an example, sometimes there are parts of the ecosystem that I don't want to help those guys. I mean, I understand they're doing the right thing, but it's really not what I want to be doing. So that's one of the criteria.
So it's a bit of a, let's say, product market founder fit kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, and another thing is that when you hit the wall, and I really, really don't like this narrative of entrepreneurs being a heroic warrior, right? That just goes forward without listening to anybody. And I think there's too much of that around. I think the entrepreneur needs to really be very, very careful to listen. And as soon as there's some signs of the trouble, stop it and pick up the next one. And that's why, again, there rarely with any technology or startup, there is only one customer or one problem. There are usually lists. So when you prioritize and you hit some sort of the bump, I mean, yeah, it's decide if it's a real bump or if it's a wall, but it's really not worth spinning the wheel and proving yourself as this, dragon slayer. But if you can pick up the next one and actually get to the market.
It's funny. I'll give you, there's a very strong example from a totally different place, but I saw a clip not long ago from the founder of Scrub Daddy. You know Scrub Daddy?
Yep.
The $1 billion brand and so on, an amazing success. They were on Shark Tank and all that. And he talks about that he developed, actually it's not that far away, because he developed this material, right? He developed material. It changes, hot water, cold water, it changes, it's a different shape and so on. So he originally developed it to clean his fingers. It wasn't for dishes. He cleaned his fingers. He says, I want clean fingers. I guess everybody else wants clean fingers. And the two holes, there was no smiley. The two holes were so he can put his fingers in and then scrape his hands and clean his hands. And then he developed it, and then it worked, and he started cleaning hands. And then he found nobody else wanted to buy a sponge to clean hands like that. And then it sat down, it sat with him for 5 years. And then he say, I can clean my dishes with it. So he added a smiley so you could put in the knife and the fork and whatever inside there. And the Scrub Daddy came to existence. And then, the rest is history.
So again, if you ask me, he could have saved himself all this frustration if he would start backwards, figuring out where the problem is, right? Because figuring out what else can I do, right, is the wrong framework. That's my mantra. That's for sure. And
Specifically for his guy, it worked out, but I understand what you're saying.
but another thing, if you're talking about mistakes, sometimes the scientists and engineers, in particular engineers, have a tendency of perfectionists,
Yes.
and you keep keep improving it and improving it. It's become such a beautiful thing. And at some point, you're like, but who cares? And again, the example that comes to mind. So I've done it the project a long time ago when I was at Yet to Come. So I apologize if the company recognized themselves, but we had a client that were developing some barrier film technology, and they had amazing capabilities that they were very selective, putting one gases in, one other with long, and they figured out how to manufacture everything, and they couldn't sell it. So what we came up with is actually to figure out the very, very niche problem that they needed to come back to the inventor and basically tell them, can you dumb it down? Because nobody needs those 15 gases. Can you make it that it just does this too? I said, well, but it's so busy. Yeah, but nobody needs it. And then they done this, which was again much cheaper, much worse technologically.
Yeah.
But they start selling it, and then they start expanding the market. Right. So this is another very complicated conversation. Stop kind of
That might be a good segue, because again, it's an example of different people talking different languages, right? So you said about the business person and the scientist talk different person, but I think also the entrepreneur and the big company talk a different language. So can you help the entrepreneur, the individual inventor understand the mind of the corporation that wants, again, and I'm assuming good faith, right? The good faith corporation that wants a strategic alliance, wants to license this technology or anything of the sort.
Yeah. Again, I'm not sure I know the mind of the big corporation, because I bring back what I said. It's done between people, right?
Okay.
And the customer is
But
always a
as a
person.
general brushstroke.
Yeah. So you need to understand the logic, and then you need to understand the geographical culture, right? So when you're dealing with Israelis, you do need to know what you're dealing with. And again, there are big companies in Israel as well, and it's different than to deal with European companies, and it's very different if you're dealing with U.S. companies. And it's fundamentally different when you're doing with Asian. So having those understanding of the different business culture is very important, and it seems like almost obvious, right? You can pull it out, or maybe you can throw it to ChatGPT and say, "How should I introduce myself?" But it really matters, right? So, for example, I was lucky enough, so I work a lot with the office in Japan, so I had a lot of, and still have a lot of partners and clients in Japan, but you do need to learn some very, very simple things. I learned that you don't negotiate with your hands or leg crossed, because in Asian culture, it will be read as that you're not listening.
Yeah.
And as many times as I was told when I present that, people say, "Oh, no, that's not what I mean. It's just more complex." I say, "I know what you mean, but that's how it will be read anyway." Yeah. So there are all those little tiny things that, again, at some point, I think the business cards are disappearing altogether, but not in Asia. And you do still have this little ritual of the business card. But I will say, please don't make your business card with the round corners, because that's not particularly considered serious. So it's more like the playful place. I don't know, you can sell flowers maybe with it. Those things are coming to the consideration. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as the generic corporate culture, as I think there is no such thing as generic startup culture. So it's very, very individual. And in my experience, I think you need to get those personal connections, just understanding where people are coming from. And then very quickly, you'll find the actual mutual ground on the content, because at the end of the day, that it is about technology, it is about the business, it is about doing something together. And I steal it from somebody, and I cannot even trace from whom by now. But the real partnership I've heard was when 1+1 = 3. Because if it's just a combination,
which I think is a good thing about any good partnership. So
yeah.
At least 3. At least 3.
Yeah, at least.
So we're coming to a close, but it's like anything very important about your work that I think people should know.
No, I don't know. Yeah, so I'm having fun, kind of closing the circle of why I left the science. I'm definitely not bored, so I'm definitely not doing the same thing, not even every day, but even within the day, especially when the days become long, because you wake up, it's Europe and Israel, then during the day it's US and a little bit of the Europe, and then at the end of the day it's Japan.
You travel the world without leaving your office, right?
Yeah, I'm actually, in that sense, thankful to COVID, because a lot of things are now happening remotely. Other than that, I used to fly to Japan for 2 days, right? Which
Yeah.
meant 2 days in the air, 2 days on the ground, and then a week to recover. So, but one thing that again I also consider sort of my personal contribution to the field, I always push to people to understand that innovation is not an event; it's a process.
Yeah.
Because invention, discovery, these are events, but we can't do anything to predict them or to actually make them happen.
Yeah.
They sort of happen. We can prepare ourselves, but we have no control. But if we looked at the innovation as a process, then there is something to learn, and it's iterative process, and there are a lot of data that comes to it.
Yeah.
So what I think I'm trying to do for all my clients is to realize how this process works so that they could repeatedly try and error without actually putting too much effort, capital, and time and figure out which of those works.
So if people want to find you, where they can find you, Eugene?
I live on LinkedIn, so that's where they can always find me, and I'm trying to put something contextually interesting there, but definitely that's where most of my connections are. WhatsApp, email. So the email is very simple. It all comes back to the Gmail, even though I do have the weird corporate extensions, but it's just eugene.buff@gmail. And one thing, I do always answer emails.
Feel good about that. So amazing. Eugene, thank you.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
It's a wrap. This Haggai podcast episode ends here, but you don't. Now, is it crazy to think that you know somebody who'd love this episode? Share it with them, and they'll love you for it.